Delacroix, through the Barbizon, through the Impressionists, people like Pissarro and many of the other artists, there was a real sense of social consciousness and almost a revolutionary sense, social revolutionary sense that went along with the revolutionary art that they were trying to create. At this point, that ceases to exist. Art becomes revolutionary without being in any way socially revolutionary anymore. And one of the things that's going on is that at the point the Fauves arrive, within a few years of their showing their work, many of them become very successful. And because especially the Americans and the Russians, some very wealthy Americans and some very wealthy Russians are descending on Paris and snapping up their paintings. So there's a very different ambience and a very different point of view at work. What's interesting about Matisse that I actually didn't know is that he's born about 100 miles northeast of Paris. He's born in a tumble-down weaver's cottage with a dirt floor, and apparently the roof leaked over his bed at night when he was a little child. And his family came from a long line of weavers. At this point, the cottage weaving industry was pretty much in ruins, which is probably why they were in such poverty when he was young. But his father was obviously a good businessman. He became a fairly successful grain merchant. And his mother, they also sold other things in the store. His mother sold paint and also mixed paint for customers. And she was also a really good painter on porcelain. But Matisse had really no interest in painting in the beginning and studied to become a law clerk. He went to Paris for that purpose in 1887. In 1889, he had appendicitis. He was at home and he had an operation, and his mother gave him a box of watercolors and some paper to paint on to amuse himself. And he said he discovered a kind of paradise. He was totally transfixed by this activity, which totally changed his life. So he decides to become a painter, much to his father's disappointment, which is a fairly common theme here with all these artists. And in 1891, he attends the Académie Julienne, and he studies under William Adolphe Bouguereau. Actually, much of Bouguereau's work is it's these kind of dancing and floating pink nudes. I thought I would spare you that and show you something a little bit more tame. But he was a very severe teacher, and Matisse found him too severe. He felt he was restricting him too much. So he joined the studio of Gustave Moreau, a symbolist and kind of a radical at the time, who encouraged his students to experiment. And when several of them started to formulate Fauvism, he actually supported them in the endeavor. I'm not, by the way, a great fan of Gustave Moreau, but apparently he was a good teacher, and he was the right teacher for Matisse. But Matisse in the beginning is very conservative. I mean, you can see the amount of patience and skill right here. But a painting without much emotion, in my opinion. And this is a studio painting, I believe in Moreau's studio. About this time, he had a daughter with a model in 1894. In 1896, he goes to visit John Peter Russell, who I haven't mentioned before, But he was an Australian who came to Paris to paint, and he was a good friend of Van Gogh's. They attended the Gorman studio together. And he actually painted a portrait of Van Gogh, the first portrait anyone painted. Quite a good traditional portrait, I think. But he went on, he accompanied Matisse, he accompanied Monet to Belle Isle to paint the Normandy. Remember when Monet went to Belle Isle and painted those very rugged seascapes with great black rocks and big waves? I showed you some of them anyway. But Peter Russell decided to stay there. And this is one of his paintings of Belle Isle. He was really quite a fine painter. He didn't need to market his work. He had an independent income, so he didn't really show very much. So he wasn't that well known. But while Matisse was with him, John Peter Russell introduced him to Van Gogh's work, because he had a Van Gogh that Van Gogh had given him. And Matisse hadn't seen Van Gogh until then, which absolutely amazed him. And he also explained Impressionist color theory to him, which Matisse had never really understood. And Matisse actually said, William Russell was my teacher, and Russell explained color theory to me. Russell, he also painted on the Mediterranean, and this is one near Antibes. You can see he was really a very fine painter. Later in life, his wife died, and he was so grief-stricken, he destroyed a lot of his artwork and returned to Australia. And it was actually his daughter who kind of saved some of his work and helped to restore his reputation. Matisse immediately starts to add more color to his work and work much more loosely. Around the time of this painting, he attends a wedding and meets Amélie Paré. And after 3 months, they marry. And they take on Matisse's daughter with the model, Marguerite, and raise her with their two sons, Jean and Pierre. And Matisse, who was known in his youth as a prankster and a singer of ribald and anti-clerical songs, becomes sort of a very traditional husband in a very traditional family. Was more than traditional. His wife, initially she's supporting him, and she's also running the household. You see him slowly, tentatively amping up the color and exploring color. And also beginning to play a little bit with the broken brushwork. He will eventually do some pointillist or loose pointillist paintings. This one is moving in that direction. This is obviously done in the studio. And around this time, Camille Pissarro advised him to go to London and look at J.M. W. Turner, which he did. But he's moving back and forth, which is something he does his whole career. And many modern artists can do. Picasso does the same thing, between one method and a slightly different method. But his work is becoming much more powerful, dramatic, and the color is becoming, it's not so natural anymore, but it still represents objects fairly convincingly. This is a painting, actually, believe it or not, of the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris. I don't know how many people know them. They've never looked like this to me, but you can see him moving towards full-scale Fauvism at this point. He's now moved to Montparnasse, where at this point, Montparnasse is becoming the center, the art center for the young struggling artists in Paris. Montmartre has become becoming too much of a tourist attraction, and the value of property has gone up. This is out his studio window at the time. And take a note of this painting. We're going to see a much different version of this view later on in the series of paintings. He's also, as you see, he's going back and forth. This is quite a fairly traditional nude, and with colors that are fairly natural.
This is a famous one, right? I've seen this one.
It's quite famous, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of this work is famous, actually. But this is his sort of manifesto. Lux, calm, et volupté. Light, calm, and voluptuousness, which is a line from a poem by Baudelaire. And by the way, Matisse loved poetry, and he read it his whole life, and it had a big impact on his work. In that way, he's very similar to Delacroix. He also played the violin, and actually, every evening after he'd painted, he would play the violin for a while. But this was painted after he spent the summer with Signac in Saint-Tropez. And Signac would actually ultimately buy this painting, which is quite large. It made a big sensation when it was shown. It was both loved and hated. This is one of his wife, I think quite a beautiful painting. He also did, we have one of his wife here in the hat at the SF MoMA.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is one of the very famous ones that he did in the next summer. He spent the summer with André Derain, who was a good friend of his, and he and Derain become the leaders of the Fauves for a short period. And this is one that, one of the most popular of that series, actually. Quite a beautiful painting. But you can see he's really pushing the limits of color and even drawing, but he's still convincing us that we're looking through a bright window at a seascape with boats. And that's what he's interested in doing. He's interested in constantly expanding what's possible, especially with color. Now, this painting, called The Joy of Life, was shown along with the other, the window painting at the Salon d'Automne in Paris. And the critics' response to these paintings and the other Fauves who showed with him, because there was now a group of them, one of the critics said, "A pot of paint has been flung in the face of the public." But with this painting, he attracted the attention of Gertrude Stein, who purchased it. This is about is at least, I think, oh, wait a minute, I know how big it is. It's 6 by 8 foot, this big painting. And she hung it in her salon where she would entertain the artists. And according to Fernande Olivier, who was the mistress of Picasso at the time, Picasso was absolutely green with envy when he saw this painting. And he was a very jealous guy, Picasso. And his response, ultimately, it took him a little while, to this painting was the Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is a very different painting. But from this moment on, Picasso and Matisse are very aware of each other. And as one writer said, they're constantly looking over their shoulders at the other one. They're in a sort of fairly friendly, mostly friendly rivalry, intense rivalry for the rest of their lives. Because they are the two, they become the two leaders of the avant-garde. Now, what's interesting, and it's the same thing with all these painters we've been discussing, mainstream French culture and mainstream art did not like either of these artists. And as with the earlier ones, but at this point, there were a lot of foreign collectors. The Steins, the Cohn sisters from America, and there was also a very important Russian collector who he had a huge, he was super wealthy, who collected like 35 or 40 of Matisse's paintings. So they were beginning to, you know, after an early struggle where some of them were very poor, they very quickly move into a point where they're being supported in what they do, which is something new. So this is his friend and partner, Henri Derain, who he spent the summer with in 1905. This was painted in 1903, but they were already friends at this point. And Derain begins in very dramatically as a fauve. With his work is less subtle than Matisse, and less, he doesn't investigate things as much. He tends to just put them on the canvas, but some very dramatic canvases using pure, you see here he's using pure color, white, and if he breaks the color, he breaks it with one of the other pure colors, just a little bit. So that even though then it's not really pointillist anymore, it is practicing divisionism, keeping the pure colors of the spectrum separate from one another in the painting. Again, they tend to work along the southern coast of France, along the Mediterranean. This is Collioure, which is actually on the western coast of the Mediterranean. And this is his portrait he did of Matisse, which is quite a fine portrait. And look how extreme he is with the color, and yet it works. In I'm trying to remember the year, but he in Vollard, the collector who began collecting Cézanne and some of the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, sends Derain to paint London, and Derain does a series of something like 40 fauve paintings of London, mostly along the Thames, which are very popular and represent, I think, some of his best work as a fauve. But he begins to back off from his color and from his broken brushwork. And over the next few years, especially as you see in 1907, there's a big exhibition of Cézanne's work, which kind of rivets everyone and leads to the start of Cubism. And the Fauves find themselves, they find themselves in the shadows of Cubism. It doesn't happen just yet, but Cubism takes center stage. And their work begins to falter. And he eventually goes in a much more traditional direction, much more muted color. And quite frankly, and you can see here, he's wrestling with Cubism. But this is about as far as he goes with Cubism. And this is as far as I take, he's no longer a Fauve, and it's really his work declines, in my opinion, declines after this. He has a very good friend, Maurice Vlaminck. Vlaminck is an interesting character. His father was Flemish and a violin teacher. His mother was from Lorraine and she was a piano teacher. And he actually plays the violin. He meets Duran by chance on a train, and it changes his life. He decides for certain he wants to be a painter, and the two of them share a studio together for a year. Then Duran has to go off and do military service he ends up doing military service for 3 years, but afterwards they again become studio mates. And while Duran is serving in the military, Vlaminck writes a couple of pornographic novels and Duran illustrates them. This is Vlaminck's portrait of Duran. And you can see Vlaminck really is a Fauve. I mean, he's like almost like a wild beast in the way he paints. But he too starts to back away from the intense color. And both of them become frustrated by the ascendancy of Cubism. Much later, in World War II, the two of them, at which point they're painting paintings that look nothing like these, with none of this adventurous color. They've moved back to more traditional styles. They're both invited to attend an exhibition in Berlin of the Third Reich. And they're accompanied by SS officers. And they're feted there, and they apparently express admiration for the Third Reich artists, the ones the Third Reich is promoting. And when they come back to Paris, Vlaminck launches, and this is 1941, we're way ahead of this point. He writes, because he's a writer, he writes an incredible attack on Picasso, claiming that Picasso has dragged art into a cul-de-sac and destroyed traditional French painting. But both of them after the war are accused of collaboration, which is maybe, I mean, it was collaboration. Of course, half the French collaborated, so, you know, I'm not sure. But it was, I think, a very unwise thing to do. Matisse did not join them. And Matisse actually, throughout his whole life, maintains complete silence around everything that's happening. And you can hardly see any evidence in his work, even of the effect of the two world wars. Another, a good friend of Matisse's, who is a kind of borderline Fauve, but a lifelong friend and correspondent of Matisse's, is Albert Marquet, who is really worth a look. I'm just showing you 2 or 3 paintings, but his work throughout his life is very consistent. It's neither Fauvism nor Impressionism. It's his own thing. But he does some wonderfully sensitive work. This is actually the Bay of Naples with Vesuvius in the distance here. Quite a lovely painting. And even though he and Matisse went in totally different directions, Matisse had a great respect for his work. Just trying to find where I am. Okay. Finally, the last of I mean, there were other fauves, but I'm giving you the key fauves who Matisse knew quite well. Georges Braque is born in Le Havre, the same place that Monet was born, and trained to be a house painter, and then decided to pick up Impressionism until he saw the Fauve show in 1905, and then he immediately switched over to Fauvism. But you can see as he at this point, he's backing away from Fauvism, and he's starting to become more interested again in form and space and using color to give a sense of that. What happens is he saw the Cézanne show, and at this point he's good friends with Picasso, and the two of them, in response to Cézanne's work, formulate Cubism. So we leave him at that point and get back. We're back in 1906 with Matisse, who is forging ahead with his experiments in color. Around this time, he's become very close to the Steins, who actually lend him their house in Fiesole near Florence, where he stays with his wife for a while and visits the art centers of Italy. But he's also, you can see him, you can see that he's been looking a little at Cézanne too, and he's playing around now with more distortion of the human figure. And he's moving away from traditional Fauvism, though I would argue that he remains a Fauve for his whole life, in the sense that he never drops his interest in extremely intense color. He's the only one who finds a way forward of the group, except for Braque, who goes in a different direction, and Marquet, who goes off on his own direction. But space, he's totally flattening the canvas, and if you see space in that, it's because you've imagined it. So Russian collector, and I'm afraid I don't have his name here. I have it in my notes somewhere, but I'm not sure I can find it. It's a really important Russian collector, collects this and many, many more of his paintings. And of course, Matisse is now in a very strong position to just be a painter and not worry about anything else. At this point, his wife, earlier on, actually, around 1902, his wife, who was had a business making hats and designing fashions for people, which was part of a larger family business. The entire family business got caught up in a huge scandal because someone who was in charge, who was not a family member, was stealing a whole bunch of money, and it created this crisis and actually this scandal. And Matisse used his understanding of law to help the family, but his wife lost her business in the process, and he became the sole supporter, and she became, apart from managing the household, his business manager. And you can see him now doing paintings which have his own paintings in them. His work is not about soul searching. It's not about our place in the universe, as you would have, as we saw with someone like Van Gogh. It's not about the contemporary world, really. It's about producing beautiful objects which make people comfortable and happy. And beautiful objects mostly for people with a lot of money. This dancing theme is recurrent in his work, and it's been suggested actually that he viewed, there's a dance called the Sardana, which is performed by fishermen in Collioure, and it's been suggested that that actually was the origin for these dance paintings, but we don't know that because he doesn't ever tell you very much about his work. So at this point in his life, he's totally absorbed in his work. He rises early in the morning, paints all morning, has lunch, has a second work session in the afternoon, then practices violin, has a dinner of vegetable soup, 2 eggs, salad, and a glass of wine, and goes to bed early. The guy is the opposite of one's image of a bohemian artist, the opposite of someone like Picasso. Very bourgeois in a certain way, but incredibly disciplined, incredibly hardworking, and his life is his art. I neglected to mention that when he proposed to his wife, Amélie, he said to her, "I would like to marry you because I love you, but I want you to understand that I would always love my painting more." I guess it was honest, but it's kind of an odd proposal. This is an interesting one because the entire canvas, except for the art objects, is almost the same red, and yet we're able to see a whole room there. He's playing all these kind of games with color and space. But when he painted people, when he had people pose for him, he was as bad as Cézanne. He would have them pose 20, 30, 100 times. And he would paint and repaint. Even something like this, if you look at it, there's been a lot of repainting around this figure. It probably changed numerous times. At this point in his life, he decides that he needs to find some new inspiration, and he follows Delacroix's footsteps to Morocco. And this is painted in Morocco, or painted from sketches in Morocco. I'm not quite sure, but he did paint there. He had the same trouble as Delacroix in terms of painting the women. The only women who would pose for him were Jewish women or prostitutes. And this woman is actually a prostitute, but he chose to paint her as a just a regular Moroccan woman in traditional dress. The this is the point at which the goldfish bowl appears in his paintings, because he observes that in Morocco everyone has goldfish bowls, and they spend their time just gazing at it and contemplating it. It's in a kind of a reverie, and he's impressed by the slower, more contemplative way of life that he discovers in Morocco. I think this is actually quite a beautiful painting, and it has a real presence, even though he's really reduced the figure and reduced the space. It works very well, in my opinion. You're welcome to interject your own thoughts as we go along. But in trying to reduce things, he really pushes the envelope in a painting like this. This is a market, and these actually look like they're worshippers, but apparently they're supposed to be melons with the green leaves of the melons. And over here we do have people at worship, prayer. So the goldfish becomes something that he actually returns to quite often as a symbol in his mind of contemplation. This is called the Yellow Curtain, though it might as well be an abstract painting. And I think at this point, and probably for a while now, if you think about it, you can see his influence on Diebenkorn, especially. Those of you who know Diebenkorn, Richard Diebenkorn's work, you can see how heavily he drew on certain works of Picasso to develop his abstract method of painting. Of Matisse to develop his abstract method of painting. So this is a portrait of his wife, painted in 1913. There were 100 sittings for this painting, and which she suffered through. But when she saw the painting, she broke into tears. She was so upset by it, and she would never pose for him again. And I have to say, it's not, I mean, it's a beautiful painting, but if it was my portrait, I might be upset too, especially if I was his wife, because he used, in his earlier paintings, he used very bright, exciting colors on her. And here he's made her this deathly gray, which works very well in the composition. I think actually it's, and again, he doesn't tell us anything about himself, and it's very hard to know anything about his private life, but I think this is the beginning of a rupture that will happen right at the opening of actually World War II. But we're now at the opening days of World War I, and his paintings definitely get darker. I think this is a lovely painting. Very unusual use of color. But, and this is remember we saw the one of Notre Dame earlier? This is a new interpretation of Notre Dame. Again, it suggests Diebenkorn's work really strongly. But this is so they went to escape all the war activity in Paris, and probably at this point the returning of dead, because that war absolutely tore European culture apart and destroyed a whole generation in France, Germany, and England. So they went to Collioure to get away from all the activity in Paris. but this is a very unusual, this is a window in colure, but it almost makes you wonder if it's not influenced in some way by what's happening around him, the darkness of it. And this was also completed during the war. This started out as a very colorful kind of paradisiacal scene, and gradually turned into this painting, which is about as close as he gets to a cubist treatment of the figure. During these years, he was struggling with the issue of cubism, and he was never able to get involved with it in any deep way, because his own view of things and what he wanted to do with art was so different. This is a self-portrait right at the end of the First World War. So in the Roaring Twenties, he's now very famous, and he's invited to do the set and the costumes for this. I'm losing my place in my notes. Forgive me for a second. It's the Ballet Russe, and it's the Chant de Rossignol, and the music is by Stravinsky, who wasn't that happy with the production when he saw it. It's about actually a mechanical mockingbird given to a Chinese emperor that so wins his affection that he ignores the living birds, and only at his death does he again appreciate the real bird. And this looks to me like the mechanical bird here, which probably I think was designed by Matisse. But during this period, this is the Roaring Twenties, and he's doing work which is all of a sudden much more realistic, and almost probably aimed at the market, I think, even though they're quite beautiful paintings. And the French public, which is to this point ignored him, responds to these paintings because it's very much in the French tradition. And he's begins to be accepted as someone in the mainstream of French culture. The French, like all the European cultures, very nationalistic. So in 1929, he comes to the United States to sit on a jury for the 29th Carnegie International Exposition. And he also meets with his son Pierre, who's now in New York and is in the preparations to open a gallery in New York, which he does, and which continues for many decades in New York, and represents Matisse as well as a number of other modern artists. He also travels to the West Coast. He actually stopped in San Francisco. He stayed with a French artist, avant-garde artist who lived here, Lucien Lebeau. And I don't know if any of you remember, there was a gallery, Lucien Lebeau Gallery, which was run by Lucien Lebeau's wife. And actually I had my very first show in San Francisco at the gallery. She would tell me a bunch of stories, including telling me about Matisse's visit and stay on his way to Tahiti, because of course, Matisse, like all the artists of that period, were very influenced by Gauguin, and he wanted to see Tahiti. But and he also was commissioned and fulfilled the commission for Barnes. And these were this mural was created specifically for this site. And a few years later, when he was in Tahiti, he just did drawings, but later he did some paintings based on his experience there. But he said an interesting thing. He said that, well, he thought Tahiti was beautiful, but he said one day follows the other and they're all exactly the same. And I think I would get tired of that. And what fascinated him more than the landscape actually were he went snorkeling, and the fish and the coral absolutely enchanted him, and would later appear in his paintings, in his color cutout paintings. So around in the 30s, this woman, Lydia Delaktorskaya, appears in his work. She's a 25-year-old Russian emigre who'd fled the revolution in Russia and was living by her wits in Nice. And he meets her on the street and he invites her to help run the household and also to be his model. And he paints any number of paintings of her. She also totally takes over the running of the household and begins to take over the running of the studio. And it's not really known if there was ever an actual affair, but at this time, but he and she get so close that Amélie confronts him and says, it's either her or me. To which Matisse says, well, it's going to be you. But so Matisse's wife fires Lydia and then leaves him. Because I think the truth of the matter is she was tired of playing second fiddle to his painting, which totally absorbed his life and everything revolved around it. Well, when Lydia was fired, she tried to kill herself. Shot herself actually, but missed any vital organ. And when she came out of the hospital, he invited her to join him. And at this point, it was the eve of the Second World War. Everyone was fleeing Paris because of the incredibly fast German advance. So he and she got in a car, loaded in all the stuff they could find that they needed, and headed for Nice in the south of France. She became, basically, she did everything for him. Ran the business, ran the household. And I think, well, yeah, she definitely still posed for him. And he did, this is a painting he did at that time. It seems a little discombobulated to me. And this is of Lydia a few years later. What's interesting to me about this painting is that there's a hint of Picasso's synthetic cubism in this work. At least I see it. Not in the displacement of form, because there isn't much of that, but in the way he's divided the face and the kind of the very sharp treatment. There's no curves on the face at all. A very powerful portrait, though. Well, in 1941, he's diagnosed with colon cancer. And he has surgery. but he's not able to stand up or walk as much as he used to. And some of the time he uses he uses a chair, or he lies in bed and works. Lydia hires nurses to help him. One of the nurses who he takes on for a while is a young woman who will later become after she's treated him for a while and also posed for some paintings and become a good friend. She becomes a nun, and her name is Sister Jacques Marie. And she enters a convent in Vence. At this point, because the Allies have begun bombing the coast of southern France and Italy, doing an incredible amount of damage, actually, he and Lydia and his studio is now in Vence. By the way, his studios tended to be hotels. He would just rent a large space in the hotel and set up one room as a studio and another room to live in. Because he had the money. He was, at this point, immensely wealthy. But his condition to some degree worsens, it becomes more and more difficult for him to stand up and walk. He uses a wheelchair more and more. He invents a whole new way of working, which he calls gouache découpée. And these are sheets of paper that Lydia had assistants paint in pure colors, very smooth application. And then he said he would draw with his scissors. He would cut out the shapes, and he would have the assistants place them, and he would direct them to place them in the, and move them around until they were in exactly the right place. And then they would glue them in place. It's a very permanent medium. And he did some incredibly beautiful work. This one is called The Sorrow of the King. And it's the story of David singing to Solomon when Solomon is an old man and he's looking back on the joys of his past life. This one is called The Snail. He did a whole bunch of drawings of snails. And then this was his artwork depicting a snail. He just worked with the spiral. So his mind, to read, it's really hard to read these paintings because what is going on in his head is not obvious, especially because he's kind of cut himself away even from any kind of literal representation some of the time. So the last 5 years of his life, as I said, he remained friends with Sister Jacques Marie, and she asked him, would he be willing to do some artwork for the convent where she was now resident. And because he not only was he wealthy, but he had some very wealthy patrons, he said, no, I will design you a chapel and I will decorate it. And with the help of architects to deal with the technical aspect of things, he designed a chapel from the ground up and managed to complete it before he died and considered it his crowning achievement. It's interesting, he kind of makes the whole thing a white canvas for these wonderfully colorful windows and reflections. And you can see the this has been involved using his method of gouache découpé. The actual stories of the actual Stations of the Cross is represented here in this very simple drawing, which just tells the story in the most simplified manner possible, but in a space that is incredibly beautiful and contemplative. And gee, that's most of what I had to say. We're actually finishing a little early here, but I'd be interested in your feedback at this point.